Summer 1945, Philippines. Japanese women prisoners clutched hidden cyanide capsules as American soldiers herded them into trucks, certain they'd be tortured and starved, just as their government had promised. But when the mess hall doors opened that first night, they were served hot beef stew, fresh white bread with real butter, and canned peaches, more food than they'd seen in years. How does a country with this much abundance treat the people they've been told are demons? And what happens when those demons discover everything they believed was a lie? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In the summer of 1944, Japan was dying. Most people just didn't know it yet. In the crowded streets of Osaka, women lined up before dawn for their ration tickets. Each family got one small bag of rice per week. Sometimes the rice was mixed with sawdust to make it stretch further. When the rice ran out, they ate sweet potato vines. When those ran out, they ground up acorns into a bitter flour that made children sick. In the cities, the smell of hunger hung in the air like smoke. Emperor Hirohito's portrait hung in every home, every school, every factory. His face watched over the nation like a god. The people believed he was divine. They believed he could not be wrong. And because he could not be wrong, the war could not be lost. The military leaders promised victory was close. Just one more sacrifice, just one more year of going without. The women would give up their cooking pots to be melted into bullets. The men would give their lives. Everyone would give everything because the emperor asked for it. In the factories, women worked 12-hour shifts making uniforms for soldiers. Their fingers bled from pushing needles through thick canvas. There was no medicine for infections. There were no bandages to spare. The factory floors were cold concrete. In winter, the women wrapped their feet in newspaper because there were no shoes left to buy. The store shelves had been empty for 2 years. Everything went to war. Everything went to the soldiers. Everything went to victory that never came. The Kempeitai walked the streets in their crisp uniforms and white gloves. These were the military police. They listened through the windows. They watched who talked to whom. If a woman said she was tired of the war, her neighbor might report her. If a man suggested that maybe Japan should seek peace, he might disappear in the night. Fear kept people quiet. Loyalty was not a choice. It was survival. Kimiko was 22 years old. She had worked in the Osaka textile mill since she was 16. Her hands were tough and scarred from the machines. She was thin, like everyone else. Her cheekbones stood out sharp in her face. Before the war, she had been pretty. Now she just looked hungry. She shared a small room with 3 other factory girls. They slept on straw mats on the floor. At night, they could hear the air raid sirens. American planes flew high overhead, silver shapes against the sun. The bombs hadn't hit Osaka yet, but everyone knew they would come eventually. Kimiko had a brother in the Navy. He had sent one letter from somewhere in the Pacific. That was 8 months ago. She didn't know if he was alive. Her mother prayed at the family shrine every morning, asking the ancestors to protect him. Kimiko prayed too, though she wasn't sure anyone was listening anymore. In early 1945, Kimiko and 50 other women were told they were being sent to the Philippines. The Japanese army needed uniforms sewn for the troops there. It was an honor to serve, the officer said. It was their duty to the emperor. The women packed their few belongings into small cloth bundles. Kimiko brought one extra dress, a comb, and a photograph of her family. That was all she owned in the world. Yuki was 28 and had trained as a nurse in Hiroshima. She was calm and efficient, the kind of person who didn't waste words. She had seen men die on operating tables because there was no anesthetic left. She had held the hands of teenage soldiers while they bled out from wounds that could have been saved with proper medicine. She learned to keep her face blank. Crying didn't help anyone. Crying wasted water the body needed. When Yuki was sent to a field hospital in the Philippines, she went without complaint. The hospital was a series of tents set up near the front lines. The heat was brutal. The air smelled like rot and infected wounds. Flies covered everything. She worked 16-hour days, washing instruments in boiled water, changing bandages made from torn sheets, and writing letters for dying men who wanted their mothers to know they had been brave. The nurses were told that if the Americans came, they should kill themselves rather than be captured. The officers said American soldiers were animals. They said Americans tortured prisoners for fun. They said American soldiers raped every woman they found and then killed them slowly. The nurses were given cyanide capsules to carry in the hems of their uniforms, just in case, just to be sure they would not suffer that fate. Yuki sewed the capsule into her collar where she could reach it quickly. She tested it once, just to make sure she could bite through the fabric if she needed to. The capsule was small and hard, like a pill. She touched it sometimes when she was afraid, just to remind herself that she had a way out, that she would not be at the mercy of the monsters. In the summer of 1945, everything happened fast. The Americans pushed through the Philippines like a wave. Their planes filled the sky. Their ships surrounded the islands. The Japanese forces fell back, then fell apart. Orders stopped coming. Officers disappeared. Soldiers threw down their weapons and ran into the jungle. At the textile factory in Manila where Kimiko worked, the machines went silent. There was no more thread, no more fabric, no more orders. The women waited in the dormitory, not knowing what to do. Then they heard the trucks. The sound of engines, loud and close. Men shouting in English. The women huddled together in the center of the room. Some of them were crying. Kimiko held her breath. American soldiers kicked open the door. They had rifles. Their uniforms were clean and pressed. They looked huge and foreign and terrifying. One of them shouted something in English. Kimiko didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. Get up, move, now. The women were herded outside into the brutal sunlight. More soldiers waited with trucks. The soldiers were pointing, directing, organizing. None of them were smiling. Kimiko's heart was hammered in her chest. This was it. This was the moment she had been warned about. She thought about running, but there was nowhere to go. She thought about the cyanide capsule she didn't have, and wished she had been given one like the nurses. At the field hospital, Yuki heard the gunfire getting closer. The last of the wounded soldiers had been evacuated 2 days before. Only the nurses remained. An officer told them to flee into the jungle, but the jungle was full of soldiers from both sides, wild animals, and no food. Yuki decided to stay. If death was coming, she would meet it here. When the American soldiers arrived, Yuki stood very still. Her hand moved to her collar. She felt the small, hard shape of the capsule under the fabric. One of the soldiers saw the movement and shouted. He raised his rifle. Yuki closed her eyes and bit down. But the capsule didn't break. Her teeth caught only fabric. The soldier grabbed her arm and pulled her hand away from her throat. He was yelling something. Another soldier, older, pushed the first one back and spoke in a calmer voice. Yuki didn't understand the words, but she understood she was not being shot. Not yet. The women were loaded onto trucks. Kimiko climbed up with shaking legs. She sat on the hard metal floor with 20 other women, all of them silent, all of them pale with fear. The truck rumbled to life and began to move. Through the open back, Kimiko watched Manila disappear behind them. She wondered if she would ever see Japan again. She wondered if Japan even still existed. She wondered what would happen when the truck stopped. Yuki sat in a different truck with the other nurses. She still had the capsule in her collar. She could try again. Maybe she should try again before they reached wherever they were going. But something stopped her. Curiosity, maybe. Or the stubborn part of her that had kept her working through all those months of blood and death. She wanted to see what came next. Even if it was terrible. Even if it was the end. She wanted to know. The trucks drove for hours. When they finally stopped, the women were ordered out. Kimiko stumbled down from the truck bed and looked around. She saw a fence, guard towers, Rows of wooden buildings. Electric lights on tall poles. The buildings had real roofs, not canvas. The ground was not mud, but gravel. Everything was organized, laid out in neat rows, and clean. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. A woman in an American uniform approached. She had a red cross on her armband. She was smiling. She held out her hands, and in them were white bars wrapped in paper and folded towels. She said something in English that sounded gentle. She gestured for the women to take them. Kimiko reached out slowly and took a bar and a towel. The bar was soap, real soap, white and smooth, and it smelled like flowers. She hadn't seen real soap in 2 years. She held it like it might disappear. That night, in a mess hall with long tables and electric lights, Kimiko sat with the other women and stared at the tray in front of her. Beef stew, thick with chunks of real meat. White bread, soft and warm. Butter in a small paper cup. Canned peaches in heavy syrup. A cup of fresh milk. She picked up the spoon with trembling hands. She took a bite of the stew. The meat was tender. The broth was rich and salty. It was the most food she had seen on one plate in 3 years. Around her, women were crying. Some were eating like they might never eat again. Some just stared. Yuki sat across from Kimiko. Tears ran down her face, but she made no sound. She whispered, so quietly, Kimiko almost didn't hear her. "I thought they would starve us." Kimiko looked at the bread in her hand. She looked at the American soldiers serving food. She looked at the lights overhead, bright and steady, powered by electricity that never seemed to run out. And she thought, everything we were told was a lie. The days that followed blurred together in a strange dream that Kimiko couldn't wake from. Every morning, a bell rang at 6. The women lined up for breakfast. Every morning, there were eggs, sometimes scrambled, sometimes fried, always eggs. There was toast with jam, there was coffee with real sugar, there was orange juice in glass pitchers, cold and sweet. Kimiko had not tasted an orange in 4 years. She drank the juice slowly, trying to make it last, trying to understand how a country at war could waste fruit on prisoners. After breakfast, the women were given work assignments. Kimiko was sent to the camp kitchen. She expected to scrub floors or wash dishes, the kind of work prisoners should do. Instead, she was handed an apron and told to help prepare lunch. The kitchen was enormous. It had 6 industrial ovens, each one as tall as a man. Stainless steel counters stretched the length of the room. There were machines for everything. A machine that mixed dough, a machine that peeled potatoes, a machine that sliced bread into perfect even pieces. A soldier named Sergeant Harris ran the kitchen. He was a large black man with a deep voice and a constant smile. He showed Kimiko how to operate the mechanical egg beater. She turned the crank and watched the metal whisks spin so fast they blurred. In 30 seconds, a dozen eggs became foam. In Japan, she would have beaten eggs by hand with chopsticks for 10 minutes to get half the result. Harris laughed at her amazed face. He said something in English she didn't understand, but his tone was kind. Every day, the kitchen baked 300 loaves of bread. Kimiko watched the dough go into the ovens as pale lumps and come out golden and perfect. The smell filled the entire building. When she broke open a hot loaf, steam rose from the inside. The bread was soft and white, nothing like the dense, dark bricks they had made in Japan from whatever grain could be found. Harris saw her staring and broke off a piece for her to eat right then. She ate it standing at the counter, and it was still warm. One afternoon, Kimiko dropped a tray of dinner rolls. 2 dozen rolls scattered across the floor. She froze, waiting for the punishment. In Japan, wasting food was a crime. People were beaten for less. But Harris just waved his hand and said something that sounded like, "Don't worry about it." Another worker swept up the rolls and threw them away. Threw them away. Perfectly good bread into the trash. Kimiko felt sick. She thought about her mother in Osaka, boiling grass for soup. She thought about children begging for rice. And here, bread was garbage. At the end of her shift, Harris gave her a chocolate bar from his own ration. The wrapper was brown and said Hershey's in silver letters. Kimiko had never tasted chocolate before. It was sweet and rich and melted on her tongue. She wanted to save half for later, but she couldn't stop herself from eating the whole thing. That night, she felt guilty for enjoying it. One morning, a supply truck arrived at the camp gate. Soldiers unloaded wooden crates stamped with red letters. Kimiko and the other women watched from the barracks window. The crates were opened, and inside were hundreds of glass bottles filled with dark liquid. An American soldier passed them out to everyone in the camp, prisoners included. He handed Kimiko a cold bottle. The glass was wet with condensation. The label said Coca-Cola. Yuki stood next to her, holding her own bottle. They opened them at the same time. The liquid fizzed and bubbled. Kimiko took a sip. It was cold and sweet and burned her throat in a strange, pleasant way. She had no idea what she was drinking. It tasted like nothing she had ever known. Yuki drank hers slowly, eyes closed, and when she opened them, they were wet. Yuki whispered, "My brother died at Iwo Jima. He was 19. He believed he was fighting monsters." Kimiko didn't know what to say. They stood together in the sun, drinking cold soda, and the wrongness of it all pressed down like a weight. Yuki had been assigned to work in the camp infirmary. She reported there every morning and worked alongside an American Army nurse named Lieutenant O'Brien. O'Brien was young, maybe 30, with red hair pulled back in a tight bun. She was brisk and efficient, but never cruel. She treated the Japanese prisoners the same way she treated American soldiers. When a prisoner came in with a fever, O'Brien gave her aspirin and a cold cloth for her forehead. When a soldier came in with an infected cut, O'Brien cleaned it and wrapped it in clean white bandages. No difference, no favoritism, just care. O'Brien showed Yuki the medicine cabinet. Rows and rows of bottles and boxes. Sulfa powder for infections. Penicillin in glass vials. Morphine for pain. Iodine. Alcohol. Bandages in sealed packages, perfectly clean and white. Yuki stared at the shelves and thought about the field hospital in the Philippines. She thought about the men who had died because she had nothing to give them but boiled water and hope. She thought about reusing bandages until they fell apart, about operating without anesthetic, about infections that spread because there was no medicine to stop them. O'Brien saw her staring and said something in English. Then she opened a medical textbook and showed Yuki pictures of how penicillin worked, how it killed bacteria, how it saved lives. Yuki understood. America had the power to heal, and Japan had nothing. The war had not been lost because Japanese soldiers were not brave enough. It had been lost because one side had everything and the other had nothing at all. In late August, word came that Japan had surrendered. The emperor had spoken on the radio. The war was over. In the barracks, the women sat in silence. Some cried, some stared at nothing. Kimiko felt numb. Japan had lost. The divine emperor had been wrong. Everything they had believed, everything they had suffered for, had been a lie. And yet, she was alive. She was fed. She was safe. The Americans had not tortured her. They had not killed her. They had given her soap and bread and chocolate. One evening, a group of prisoners asked permission to celebrate Obon, the festival for honoring the dead. Kimiko expected the request to be denied. Instead, the camp commander approved it. American soldiers brought the women rice, incense, and colored paper for folding. They helped set up a small shrine in the corner of the recreation yard. One young soldier, whose name tag said Jensen, helped Kimiko fold paper cranes. His hands were clumsy, but he tried. She asked him in broken English why he was helping. He looked uncomfortable. He said, "My brother died at Guadalcanal, but the war's over now. You're just people." Just people. Kimiko thought about that phrase for days. Not enemies, not demons,
just people. She had been taught that Americans were something other than human. But they bled when cut, they cried when they were sad. They were kind when they didn't have to be. The propaganda had been so complete, so total, that even now, even with the evidence all around her, part of her mind struggled to accept the truth. At night, Yuki wrote in a notebook she had been given. She wrote in Japanese, small characters that filled page after page. She wrote, "I believed in my emperor. I believed the stories. But how do you fight a country that gives its enemies ice cream? How do you win a war when your people are starving and theirs are throwing away bread? We were taught that sacrifice and loyalty would bring victory. But they won with abundance. They didn't need us to suffer. They didn't need to be cruel. They just had more of everything, and that was enough." Kimiko lay on her bunk and stared at the ceiling. The electric lights hummed quietly overhead. Outside, she could hear soldiers laughing. Somewhere, someone was playing music on a radio. She thought about Osaka. She thought about her mother and father, if they were still alive. She thought about what she would tell them when she saw them again. How could she explain this? How could she make them understand that everything they believed was wrong? She wasn't sure she understood it herself. She only knew that the world had turned inside out, and she would never see it the same way again.
November arrived with cooler weather, though nothing like the cold winters Kimiko remembered from Osaka. The camp commander announced that the prisoners would be sent home soon. Ships were being prepared. Arrangements were being made. But first, there would be a special meal. The Americans called it Thanksgiving. It was a holiday about being grateful, about sharing food with others. The prisoners were invited to join. The mess hall was decorated with paper turkeys and colored leaves cut from construction paper. Long tables were pushed together to make room for everyone. Kimiko walked in with the other women and stopped at the entrance. She had never seen so much food in one place. The tables were piled high with roasted turkeys, golden brown and glistening. There were bowls of mashed potatoes so large she could have bathed in them. Gravy in pitchers, cranberry sauce that looked like dark red jelly, sweet potatoes topped with melted marshmallows, green beans, corn, fresh rolls with butter, and at the end of each table, whole pumpkin pies, their crusts perfectly crimped, still warm from the oven. The women stood frozen in the doorway. An American chaplain stood at the front of the room. He wore a simple uniform with a cross on the collar. He asked everyone to bow their heads. He spoke in English, but his tone was gentle. He talked about gratitude, about being thankful for peace, about being thankful for enough food to share. He did not talk about victory. He did not talk about enemies. He talked about being glad that the killing had stopped. When he finished, the soldiers began serving the prisoners first. They carried plates to the tables where the Japanese women sat. They piled the plates high with turkey and all the side dishes. A young soldier with freckles put 3 rolls on Kimiko's plate and smiled at her. He said something in English that sounded friendly. She nodded because she didn't know what else to do. Kimiko stared at her plate. The food was still steaming. The turkey was sliced thick, and when she cut into it with her fork, juice ran out onto the plate. She put a piece in her mouth. It was tender and seasoned with herbs she couldn't name. It tasted like something from another world. She looked around the table. Some women were eating carefully, as if the food might vanish. Others were crying silently, tears running down their faces as they chewed. Then Kimiko broke. The sob came from somewhere deep in her chest, a place she had kept locked for months. Her whole body shook. She put her face in her hands and wept. She couldn't stop. She cried for her brother who was probably dead. She cried for her mother eating grass soup. She cried for all the lies she had been told. She cried because she had been so afraid, and because the people she feared had given her more kindness than her own government ever had. Yuki sat across from her, dry-eyed but pale. Yuki stared at the mountain of food on her plate and thought about Hiroshima.
She had learned that the city was gone, destroyed by a single bomb. She didn't know if her parents had survived. She thought about the children she had treated in the field hospital, the ones who died from dysentery because there was no clean water. She thought about the soldiers who bled out because there was no medicine. She thought about the officers who told her that suffering was noble, that sacrifice was the highest virtue, that Japan would win because its spirit was pure. Yuki picked up her fork and put it down again. She whispered, "We were lied to about everything. Our leaders sent us to die for what? For pride? For an empire built on hunger?" She looked at the American soldiers eating at the next table. They were laughing about something. One of them had cranberry sauce on his chin. They looked like ordinary men. Not demons, not monsters, just young men who wanted to go home. The same as the Japanese soldiers she had treated. Around them, other prisoners were having the same realization. A woman named Sachiko, who had worked in the munitions factory, said quietly, "They didn't need to humiliate us. They could have. They could have starved us, or beaten us, or worse. But they didn't. Why didn't they?" Another woman, Michiko, said, "Because they don't need to. They already won. They won before the war even started. Look at all this. Look at what they have. How were we supposed to fight this?" In the days after Thanksgiving, the prisoners were shown newsreels in the recreation hall. They watched footage of the atomic bombs, the mushroom clouds rising over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the burned cities, the shadows of people burned into walls. They watched the surrender ceremony on the deck of the battleship Missouri. They watched their emperor, their living god, sign papers that said Japan had lost. Some women turned away. Some watched with empty faces. Kimiko watched everything. She felt she owed it to herself to see the truth, no matter how much it hurt.
The Americans started offering English lessons. A teacher came 3 times a week. She taught them simple phrases. Hello, thank you, goodbye, please. The teacher also taught them about how America worked. She explained that America had no emperor, that the leaders were chosen by the people, that if the people didn't like their leaders, they could choose new ones. The idea seemed impossible to Kimiko. Choose your own leader? Tell your government it was wrong? In Japan, that would get you arrested or killed. A Japanese-American translator visited the camp. His name was Mr. Tanaka. He had been born in California, and he spoke both languages perfectly. He gave a talk about democracy. He explained that in America, power came from the people, not from a divine right. He said that leaders could be questioned, that newspapers could criticize the government, that citizens had rights that could not be taken away. The women listened in silence. Some looked skeptical. Some looked hungry for knowledge. Kimiko thought, this is why they won. Not just because they had more food or better weapons. They won because their people were free to think. Yuki wrote in her journal that night. Her handwriting was small and cramped, filling every inch of the page. She wrote, "I thought power was about sacrifice and obedience. I thought strength came from enduring suffering. But America's power came from abundance. They didn't win because they were crueler. They won because they were richer, freer, and smarter. They built a country where people had enough, where people could speak, where people could choose. And they didn't need to humiliate us to prove it. That's what real strength looks like, not the kind that starves its own people for glory." Before the women left for home, each one was given a care package. Inside were canned goods, beans, and soup and vegetables. There were bars of soap wrapped in paper. There were wool blankets, thick and soft. There was a simple dress made of cotton, nothing fancy but clean and new. Kimiko held her package and counted the items. This was more than she had owned before the war, more than her family had owned. She thought about bringing it home to Osaka. She imagined her mother's face when she saw real soap, real food.
Would her mother understand what it meant? Would she understand that the enemy had given them more than their own country ever could? Yuki packed her care package carefully. She folded the dress and placed it at the bottom of her small bag. She put the canned goods on top, heavy and solid. She tucked the soap and blanket around the edges. She closed the bag and sat on her bunk, holding it in her lap. She thought, I'm bringing home proof. Proof that everything we believed was a lie. Proof that there's another way to live. But will anyone believe me? Or will they think I've been corrupted by the enemy? She didn't know. She only knew that she could never know what she had learned here. The truth had gotten inside her, and it had changed everything. The repatriation ship left from Manila in early December 1945. Kimiko stood at the railing with her care package clutched to her chest and watched the Philippines disappear into the horizon. The ship was crowded with Japanese prisoners, all of them going home. Some were excited, some were afraid. Most were silent, lost in their own thoughts. The voyage took 9 days. The women slept in bunks below deck. They were fed 3 meals a day from the ship's kitchen. Even here, even on the journey home, there was enough food. Kimiko ate her portion slowly, knowing that when she reached Japan, the abundance would end. Yuki spent most of the voyage on deck, staring at the ocean. She tried to imagine what Hiroshima would look like now. She had seen the newsreels. She had seen the photographs of the flattened city, the skeletal buildings, the rubble stretching for miles. But seeing pictures and seeing the real thing were different. Part of her didn't want to know. Part of her wished the ship would just keep sailing forever, suspended between 2 worlds, belonging to neither. The ship docked in Yokohama on a gray morning in mid-December. The sky was low and heavy with clouds that threatened snow. As the gangplank was lowered, Kimiko could see the city beyond the port, or what was left of it. Yokohama had been bombed again and again. Whole neighborhoods were gone. Buildings stood like broken teeth, their walls collapsed, their roofs caved in. Smoke still rose from some areas, as if the fires had never quite gone out. The smell hit her as soon as she stepped onto the dock. Ash and decay, and something worse underneath. The smell of a country that had lost everything.
The women were processed through a checkpoint where Japanese officials recorded their names and asked questions. Where had they been held? How had they been treated? Were they injured? Kimiko answered in a flat voice. She didn't tell them about the beef stew or the Coca-Cola or the Thanksgiving feast. She didn't think they would understand. Or worse, she thought they might accuse her of lying, of being a traitor, of sympathizing with the enemy. So she said she had been fed and not harmed, and left it at that. She was given a train ticket to Osaka. The train was packed with people, far more than the seats could hold. People stood in the aisles, pressed together, holding on to overhead straps or each other. Many of them were thin to the point of sickness. Their clothes hung loose on their bodies. Their eyes were hollow. Kimiko found a place to stand near the door and held her care package tight. She could feel people looking at it, wondering what was inside. The train ride took 6 hours. Through the window, Kimiko watched the countryside pass by. Rice fields that should have been harvested were overgrown with weeds. Villages were empty, their houses damaged or destroyed. She saw children standing by the tracks, their hands out, begging for food from the passing train. The train didn't stop. It just kept moving through the ruined landscape, carrying its cargo of broken people home. Osaka was worse than Yokohama. The firebombing had been thorough. Entire districts were gone, burned to ash and swept away. The streets were filled with rubble. People picked through the debris, looking for anything useful. A piece of metal, an unbroken brick, a scrap of cloth. Kimiko walked through streets she didn't recognize. The landmarks were gone. The shops where she used to buy rice, the school where she had learned to read, the temple where her family prayed, all of it was ash.
She walked for an hour before she found the neighborhood where her family's house had stood. It was gone. The whole block was gone. Just a flat space of burned ground with a few foundation stones poking through. Kimiko stood in the middle of where her house used to be and turned in a slow circle. She remembered where the kitchen had been, where she had slept with her sister, where her father had kept his tools. Now there was nothing, not even debris. It had all been cleared away or scavenged. An old woman approached her from the ruins of the next lot. The woman's face was deeply lined, her back bent. She asked Kimiko who she was looking for. Kimiko told her the family name. The old woman nodded slowly. She said the family had survived the bombing. They were living in a shelter on the east side of the city, near the river. She gave Kimiko directions. As Kimiko turned to leave, the old woman said, "You came back from the war?" Kimiko nodded. The old woman said, "My son didn't." Then she turned and walked away, disappearing into the ruins. The shelter was a long wooden building that had once been a school. Now it housed 50 families, all of them living in the classrooms, separated by hanging blankets. Kimiko found her parents in a room they shared with 2 other families. Her mother saw her first. She screamed and ran to her daughter, grabbing her, holding her so tight Kimiko couldn't breathe. Her father stood slowly from where he had been sitting on the floor. He looked old. He had aged 10 years in the months she had been gone. He came to her and put his hand on her head, the way he used to when she was a child. He didn't say anything. He just stood there with his hand on her head and cried. That night, Kimiko opened her care package. She took out the canned goods and the soap and the blanket. Her mother stared at the cans like they were made of gold. Her father picked up the soap and smelled it, his eyes closing. Kimiko opened a can of beans with the little key attached to the lid. She poured the beans into a pot and heated them over a small fire in the courtyard. The smell brought people from other rooms. They gathered around, watching silently. Kimiko's mother served the beans to the family and the 2 families they shared the room with. Each person got 5 spoonfuls. That was all there was, but it was more protein than some of them had eaten in a week. Kimiko's mother ate her beans slowly, savoring each bite. Then she started to cry. Not gentle tears, but deep sobs that shook her whole body. She said, "How did we lose so badly? How did we lose to people who can give their prisoners food like this?" Kimiko didn't answer. There was no answer that would make sense. No answer that would make the loss hurt less. Her brother never came home. They learned later that his ship had been sunk in the Philippine Sea in June 1944. He had been dead for over a year before the war ended. Kimiko's mother built a small shrine for him in the corner of their shared room. She burned incense that Kimiko bought with money she earned working in a textile factory. The factory was being rebuilt with American help. American engineers came and showed the Japanese workers how to use new machines, more efficient machines, machines that could do the work of 10 people. Kimiko watched the engineers and thought about Sergeant Harris and the industrial kitchen. This is how they won, she thought, not just with bombs, with organization, with resources, with knowing how to build things that worked. Yuki's journey home was different. When she reached Hiroshima, she found that the center of the city was simply gone. There was a wide, flat space where buildings had stood. The ground was scorched black. In the distance, a few concrete buildings remained, their walls standing but their insides gutted. The famous dome building stood like a skeleton, its metal frame exposed, a monument to destruction. Yuki walked through the ruins and felt nothing. The devastation was too complete for grief. It was beyond human emotion. It was the end of the world. She found her parents alive, living in a shack built from scrap metal and boards salvaged from destroyed houses. They had been outside the city when the bomb fell. They had survived, but they had lost everything else: their home, their neighbors, their city. When they saw Yuki, they embraced her and wept. Her mother was so thin, Yuki could feel every bone in her body.
That night, Yuki opened her care package and shared the contents with her parents. Her mother took the canned beef and stared at it for a long time. Then she opened it and divided it into 3 portions. They ate in silence. When they finished, Yuki's mother began to cry. She said, "I'm ashamed. Ashamed that the enemy feeds us better than our own country did. Ashamed that we lost. Ashamed that I'm grateful for this food." Yuki held her mother's hand and said, "Don't be ashamed. Be angry. Be angry at the people who lied to us. Be angry at the leaders who sent our people to die for nothing. But don't be ashamed of surviving." Yuki found work as a nurse again, this time in a clinic set up by the American occupation forces. She worked alongside American doctors and nurses, treating Japanese civilians. She learned more about modern medicine. She learned about antibiotics and vitamins and sterilization techniques that could have saved thousands of lives if Japan had known about them, if Japan had been able to afford them. She realized that the war had not just been lost on the battlefield. It had been lost in the laboratories and the factories and the farms. Japan had been fighting with swords against machine guns, with hunger against abundance. It had never been a fair fight. Years passed. Kimiko married a man who had survived the war as a prisoner in Siberia. They had 2 daughters. Kimiko worked in the textile factory until it became one of the most modern in Japan. The country was rebuilt with American money and American technology. Within 20 years, Osaka looked new again. Gleaming buildings, paved streets, shops full of goods. Kimiko walked through the city and marveled at how quickly things had changed. But she never forgot. She never forgot what it felt like to be hungry. She never forgot the taste of beef stew in the POW camp. She never forgot that the enemy had shown her more kindness than her own government. She told her daughters about the war, but not everything. She told them about being captured and being afraid. She told them about learning that the Americans were not monsters. But she didn't tell them about the abundance, the waste, the shocking contrast. She wasn't sure they would believe her. The new Japan was prosperous. Her daughters had never known real hunger. They had never lived through a war. How could they understand?